thank you to our funders, to all of you for being here, and members of my lab. This is not a solo effort. I'm representing the interdisciplinary program for empathy and altruism research with specific collaborators listed here. Andrea Furo-Forbes has been quite helpful this entire time in helping to, you'll see the study we have done is very challenging, so she deserves special credit. Okay, so what is empathy? We could have a half-hour talk on this topic. It's hard to define. It's very complex and many different definitions. So I'm going to take the easy way out, and I'm going to say it's all of the above. So there are aspects to empathy. So there's cognitive aspects, including traits like perspective taking, or the tendency to imagine what other people might be thinking or feeling from their perspective, seeing the world from their perspective. So in this case, perspective taking for me would be me seeing you seeing me, if that makes sense, which I'm trying not to do. Then there's reading other people's emotions. So you can use cues like facial expressions, body language, and so on to try to infer what the person might be thinking or feeling. And this is based on, you can just use external cues. So you don't necessarily have to go inside the person's mind for this. Then there are more emotional aspects to empathy, such as trait empathic concern. So this is the actual feeling of when another person is in distress, or sometimes, this is empathic concern, not empathic joy, but when another person is in distress, feeling for them, suffering with them. Sometimes it could be called compassion. I think that's more of the feeling of empathic concern, whereas there's also a tendency for some people to say they do this more than others. Situational or induced empathy are the actual momentary feelings, such as compassion. And there's also motivational elements, so you can have the desire to help itself, which I think of sort of more on the affective or emotional domain. And then all of these we care about, I think, because ultimately we think that these traits are associated with an increased likelihood of prosocial behavior, so helping and caring, sharing, giving, donating, generosity, whatever the words are, and also less aggression at times. So a general definition is a positive and also responsive orientation of the self toward others, and it's typically contrasted with egotism, which is, in many ways is conceptually, I would say, the opposite of this. So is empathy a character trait? Well, I'll also take the easy way out here and say that some people think it is. Chris Peterson and Martin Seligman, in their book on character strengths and virtues, define the trait of kindness to include, they do very sort of broad definitional, just like I do, to include empathy and other related traits. It's central to moral and ethical thoughts, feelings, behavior, reasoning. And I see it as a way for us to move from ourselves as individuals to something bigger than ourselves, to we-ness. And that's how it works morally, or why it's morally central. And there are also consistent individual differences in empathy, however you operationalize it, any of those constellation of traits or behaviors or responses. And some of these are partially driven by motivation and practice. So that makes me think there's something here that is not only a trait, but is a trait that we can actually make choices about and choose to develop and work on. I would say that one thing that we don't talk about too much right now in the empathy literature as including, as part of this trait is the moral aspect to it. There are researchers who are studying the principle of care, which is just a general it's sort of cognitive belief that other people, whoever they are, deserve care and help and so on. Now each of these can be independent, but I think they're pretty much intercorrelated, although it's possible, of course, to have one and not the other and so on. So we're all complicated constellations of these things. So there's different ways to think about empathy. And again, I'm Canadian, so we always look for compromise. And I'm going to stay in the middle again, and I'm going to say it's both probably. But so there's some theorists who say empathy is more of a trait. It's something you're born with. You really can't do much about it. It's a disposition that starts off very young. And then there are many who believe that it's something that can be developed, that can be changed with our environment. I think nowadays most of us do take that middle ground, but there's evidence for both. So there's evidence that it's strongly heritable. So studies find that up to 50% of individual differences in at least the trait of empathy are related to genetic factors. Children who score high in empathy at one point in time also score high at a later time point, which shows some cross-situational consistency. And also within adults, there's a great study. There's not many longitudinal studies actually in the adult lifespan, but there was one study by Daniel Gruen and his colleagues finding that across a 12-year time span, adults did not change overall, or at least it wasn't statistically coming out. They were very consistent in their empathy scores over time. And also, there's what I meant to say there is there's also cross-situational consistency. So children who will show empathy more to their mothers will also show empathy more to strangers. And these are all on average, but it just makes me think that there is some aspect to this that is somewhat fixed. And in other words, you could almost think that there are some people who are more natural at empathy, and it's just something that is almost like some people are more natural to be an athlete or something. So there are these people that I think do exist. And then there's the rest of us who probably, I thought your talk was really helpful actually, Christian, in thinking about who are these people. I think they're probably rare, but I think they do exist. But many of us are, regardless of what we might score in general on a trait or version of empathy, when we encounter situations that evoke the feeling of compassion, Dan Batson's work, Christian also correctly characterized, it shows that on average people will respond to help if they can more often. And he's ruled out a number of different egotistical motives for that. It's also affected by motivation, although not many researchers have looked at this aspect to it. But there are some studies that find that you can offer somebody an incentive to become more empathically accurate, and they will be under that circumstance. We know you can learn. Many of us are scholars. We know that you can teach students, and sometimes you have to waive the little grades or whatever you have. So incentives do seem to matter. And people can be induced to be in empathic states, even when there's the easy ways to avoid it. So motivation is important, I think. And our prior work has looked at least people's self-perceptions of empathy over time, so their dispositions to see themselves as empathetic. And there's been declines in college students across the past 30 years, which tells me that I don't think their genes are changing, I think, but that they're probably environmental situations that are influencing their perceptions of themselves over time. And empathy can also be taught and learned, and research has shown this. Parenting styles are correlated with higher empathy in children. So if any of you are parents, I have 2 little ones now, and this is a good thing to know if you want to teach your kids how to be more empathetic. You might want to ask them to imagine how people would feel based on their actions and so on. And you can do this with storybooks and so on. And I was talking to somebody yesterday at dinner who did this very well and ended up with a daughter who cried because the ants were stepped on. And I thought that was very sweet. But it definitely was effective training. And there are a number of also just classic, intervention programs that try to change empathy however they define it and seem to be successful. So here are some ways that have been shown in the literature. So if you train people to improve their emotion recognition abilities or their social skills, they tend to have more empathy, at least based on some of the measures that we use. When the similarity between themselves and others is manipulated, is taught to be increased or highlighted, then they'll also have higher empathy. If they role play, they actually get into that person's space and imagine what it would be like to be them by actually acting it out. They can have higher empathy afterward. Practicing just without even role playing, just getting it, imagining in somebody's mind, you can have higher empathy from that. And of course, observing and being exposed to other people's misfortunes can also increase our empathy, but this could backfire. I think each of these could backfire under certain circumstances, but on average, they show effects in a positive direction. And one that I think we don't really think about as much as we should, but I thought it was the talk on moral exemplars was really interesting for this reason, that we can have higher empathy when we see somebody who we see as compassionate and empathetic, and we want to be like that person. Okay, so here's where it starts to get interesting. So most of the studies have done the typical didactic teaching method, which is great and seems to work. But the problem with the in-person teaching approach is the problem that Christian's aware of, because he's had to fly us all here. It's expensive. You have to bring everybody into one room, and it's expensive in time and money and other things. The other thing is, it's a good thing for this conference, but it's absent from everyday interactions. So you get to kind of, when you bring people into a room and try to teach them how to be empathetic, it's pretty decontextualized from their everyday interactions, and they could take all the role playing they want and still go home and like yell at their kids and shake their fists. And also, it's hard to disseminate to a wide group of people. But yet there are a couple of creative studies that have found that you can teach empathy using just videos. So that's kind of cool. I mean, this is something I just recently learned. And these are either from the 80s and 90s. So, but I still think it would be good to integrate empathy lessons into daily life. And the answer, I think, is within our pockets or pocketbook. I tried to make that work. I'm sorry. I know we call it purses and everything like that. But I think the answer is in our phones. So this is not too wild of an idea if you know anything about public health research lately. It's actually quite commonly used in public health. Because the problem they have in public health is, well, how do you take this average person who's not very motivated by being healthy and just change their habits? So basically, public health is a study of like how to change habits. It would be very useful, I think, to understand how to change character, if character is a habit, by looking at some of the approaches that are used in that domain. But they have successfully looked at how to make people exercise more, eat healthier, smoke less. I've given you a few examples, but this was easy to do because you can type in text message, public health intervention in Google Scholar and get so many. Like, this is just, to them, when I've told a couple of my friends who have this background, they're just like, yeah, of course, whatever. Thanks for copying us. So this is not, but it's surprising, I think, within a context of trying to do a social psychology intervention. I don't think it's something we've thought about too much yet. And I just want to point out, hang on a second while I point that out. I just have to send a text. You can see that it's, yes, we know what text messaging is, we know what it does. We realize that in the middle of an interaction, we might have asked somebody to be more empathetic, and they were talking to somebody, but they're like, hang on a second. Oh, okay. All right. So, how are you feeling? Yeah, I'm here. We get that. It's a bit weird to do this with empathy. I think it is. And I acknowledge that. So, I'm going to, I think, take the perspective of Mary Gordon from the Roots of Empathy, which is a program that's very expensive but very effective, where they bring babies into schools and they try to teach empathy by learning about the baby and what they feel and think and so on, and their needs. And I think I agree with her that teaching empathy is likely going to be more effective in a face-to-face setting, but that's not always possible for various reasons. And also, I know that there's been a major generational shift, and I know that it's a bit stressful, and personally I'm anxious about the whole changes we've been going through as well in our society, and I'm wondering what's the future going to be and so on. But I think the future is going to involve these things in some form. And so I don't mean to be glib, but I think it's important to think of, instead of complaining about all the ways that technology is ruining us, to wonder whether we can use these. They're tools. Hammers don't ruin us, but hammers can ruin a person if you use them as a weapon. We have to think about how can we use these as tools. And so I'm trying to kind of push that idea a little bit, even though I think possibly one of the causes of changing empathy in college students is this very different way of socially interacting and a lot fewer face-to-face, deep social interactions over time. So the research question is, can we use text messages to help to build empathic character? And I'm hoping that, I'm hoping for a radically skeptical response. I'll just say that. So just please feel free in that discussion part to bring that up. So we did run a study thanks to this funding. I have run a number of crazy, labor-intensive studies in my time. And I think this one is now at the top, which is cool because now I have a challenge. I can go further next time. This was a study that it literally caused me to lose sleep at night. It was just, you think, oh, big deal, 90 students. Well, just you'll hear about it in a second. 90 college students, mean age 21, 40% male, 52% white, 33% Asian, so it's racially diverse. Data was collected from November 2012 to May 2013, so we just have fresh, clean data available. It took a long time to enter the data and clean it. And the design of the experiment is a pre-post experimental study with 3 conditions. So I'm just going to say that in everyday language in a minute. So just to give you an overview, and then I'm actually going to give you the messages. I'm going to text you all. I'm going to hand them out. It's much better that way. So people came into the lab for a pre-intervention session. We measured a number of those constellation that I showed you of those ways of looking at empathy at time 1. And then we randomly assigned them to conditions that they would have empathy messages, self or objective control messages, and then no messages. So I'm just going to pass these out. Can you maybe help with that? Okay. I need one, though. Thanks. I hope there are enough. But an example of an empathy message, so I broke down what we call empathy into behavioral, cognitive, and emotional types of messages, just to try to get a bigger picture rather than trying to teach one aspect of empathy, try to teach a bigger picture. Example of a behavior would be send a nice text message to someone close right now and try to make them feel loved. So I'm using text messaging, even in text message intervention, to try to increase empathy. Of a cognitive message, imagine what the last person you interacted with was thinking about. What does the world look like from their perspective? Of an emotional one, reflect on somebody close to you. What is the most recent thing in their life that made them feel sad or disappointed? And how can you be there for them? And those are the empathy ones. And you can see in the handout there, I tried to make counterpoint messages for each of those domains. And what we did was had a larger body of messages first that we had raters code for how self-focused versus other-focused they were and how cognitive versus emotional the messages were. So we tried our best to try to match at that level. The word counts overall turned out to be matching. That took a little, actually the character counts, and that took some work there. So we did try our best to make them around the same level of difficulty and so on. I'm just going to give you a moment now to just scan them. I know it's a little awkward, but I think that's important so you can see what we're actually doing here. And I want to point out that for the third group, there were no messages that they received, intervention messages that they received, but all participants received messages that were asking them about their current mood, feelings of connection to others, who they were interacting with, by which mode, and something else that I forgot. But anyway, so everybody's sending messages. Some of them are getting intervention messages related to the self or the other, and some are not. So there was a 14-day period where they received 6 text messages a day. Now, try to take the perspective of our participants. I mean, really? But what we were trying to do was create habit, or something like it. We wanted to make it kind of like a lot. And I think we might have went over the threshold of annoying. I don't know. But 6 a day is a lot, especially because we wanted them to respond to us 6 times a day as well. And then participants came back into the lab and completed the same measures as before. Again, that constellation I showed you of how to define empathy in a broad sense. Okay, so here are the measures. And you can see it overlaps with this idea of the constellation of empathy. Oh, before I get into the results, let me just say that one of the things I'm doing right now, and that I'm not prepared really to speak about or show you graphs on or anything like that, is, so what I'm going to show you in this talk is just the results of that intervention. But I have also been intrigued by some of the talks I've heard here about character and the depth of character. So I have been looking at, for each of those different ways of measuring empathy, the top people. And it's not always the same person, but overall you can create a score of the people who are in the top 30% of each of those. And then you can sum them up, and then you can classify them as the highest middle and lowest. So there is a way to kind of look at sort of a tendency to have this constellation. And I have run an analysis that I mean, just to see, does empathy at time 1 predict the behavior of helping at the second time when they come in, regardless of condition? And so this, if you take away the behavior, and it's just now the empathy constellation, we find that it's a huge predictor of future behavior, controlling for how they behaved at the beginning. It's huge, and it's way bigger than any effect I'm going to show you here today. So that's something I'm going to kind of continue and develop, but it was interesting. And because when I say things like that, this is why some of my colleagues at University of Michigan called me a failed social psychologist, because I'm like sort of saying that there are these people who are empathetic. And so anyway, I apologize, but I'll give you some social psychology. Here it is. Okay. So we looked at, most of our participants are regular volunteers. It's just what college students do nowadays. So we couldn't look at and we wouldn't expect that they would have decided to change their life and become a volunteer in the 2 weeks anyway. But we did look at the reasons that they listed for their volunteering. We just said, why do you volunteer? Please list a few reasons. And they just wrote them out. And we coded them for whether they were related to because they wanted to help people or because it made them feel good, which were the two most common responses. And sometimes people would say both. And this analysis is just looking at the effect of condition. And I collapsed the 2 control conditions. So it's self, other, plus the non, just to make this easier to talk about. And the effect of condition on the percentage of people who will endorse those reasons. Does that make sense? Okay. So in terms of people who say the reason they volunteer, all of these students are regular volunteers, the reason they volunteer is because they want to feel good. After our intervention, this goes down. There are fewer people who are saying this. The reason they volunteer is because they want to help others. There are more people who say this. But notice that there's already a lot of people to begin with who are saying this. This is, I guess, part of why people volunteer. So as for actually the percentage of people, so in our lab study, I can't get into details because of time, but we did the classic Batson task where we exposed people to a person who was in distress, who they believed was a real person in distress, and we gave them an opportunity to anonymously help her, and they could help via a paper response sheet, which they would put in a sealed envelope and nobody would see. The research assistants wouldn't see. It was a sealed envelope with a stamped address on it, and nobody was going to see it. It was just a choice they could make. So what happens here is, in terms of percentage of people who choose to help, nothing. We're not changing the percentage of helping in this situation. What we're changing a little bit of is how many hours they're willing to give to this person in distress. So they're just giving a little more time. It's not, I don't think this is a huge effect, but it's a marginally significant effect. And it was under a situation where we asked all participants to empathize with the target, because we wanted to put a very high threshold for our effect to see if the behavior would change even in that circumstance. And so there's a little more helping behavior, or at least commitment. If they do say they're going to help, they're a little more committed. Aggression is something that I've studied in the past and I'm still interested in. And so I looked at also aggressive beliefs that people have, and the scale goes from 1 to 3. But this is basically whether you think it's okay to use aggression to handle whatever. If somebody hits you, should you hit them back? With lower numbers being no, you shouldn't, and higher numbers being every time. Okay, so this is a gendered issue. Can you guess who endorses this more often than which one, men or women? Take a guess, you'll be right. It's one of these, It's one of these safe things, you can just guess. Okay, so yes, on average, males endorse this. I'm not talking about the males in this room, obviously. But on average, males, our college student subjects, say that it's okay to be aggressive in response to various provocations. Females are less likely to say this. So here are the males in the control condition, and this, by the way, endorsing these beliefs also is related to the behavior of aggression in laboratory aggression studies. So here are the males who are the endorsement properties here, and here they are after the empathy intervention. And what I really like about this is, yay, they're just like women. Sorry. I'm done now. Okay, so empathy intervention slightly increases prosocial behavior and motivation, decreases some aggressive beliefs in males. Females, you know, they didn't need it. I guess we should all be down at the very bottom, but whatever. So can we conclude then we help to build empathic character in our intervention? Not yet, because these are commonly used measures. Okay, these are actually the standard measures that would be used to justify that an empathy intervention worked. Any of these would say this worked, we're done. But as you can see, my constellation of empathy is a little bit bigger than that, and it gets really interesting here. First of all, there was experimental demand working on these people. Even though it was anonymous in their helping behavior, it's possible that they were just doing what they thought they wanted us to do in this helping behavior. So we don't know. And the research assistants are obviously blind to the condition. They didn't know who it was. They had no way to know who had had the intervention. But the participants had every way to know 6 times a day that they had received something. Even we called it a social skills study. But I think by the end of it, the empathy people kind of got it. Like, you're trying to teach me to be a good person. Okay. So it's possible that all of these things that I'm showing you are just because they're in the lab and they're like, oh, this is what they want to see. Well, I have something to say about that. Luckily, at the last minute before we started running the study, we decided to include observer reports of empathy, the research assistants. And we kind of were like, why should we include this? They're not going to know like how empathetic a person is just from 2 hours in a laboratory session. How can they know this? The person's filling out questionnaires. They walk in the room and say, hello, would you like the next one? Are you done yet? This is really the extent of the interactions. And yet, and so they just rate how empathetic is this participant, and there was variance, and they are trying to do it. And they're blind to the condition, and they don't know what the person has done in terms of helping because it was in a sealed envelope. So what we find is in the control conditions, there's no change over time in their ratings of empathy, but in the empathy condition, they suddenly start to see these participants as more empathetic. Again, it could have been the participants just coming in and putting on their best face, who knows. But I thought this was a little stronger. So the empathy intervention does this slight increase in prosocial behaviors, motivation, decreases aggressive beliefs. It makes observers see participants as more empathetic. And again, this is way beyond the standard of what you typically see in these interventions, but it's going to get interesting, and then I'm going to stop, so please bear with me. How do these participants see themselves? Okay, so here's empathic concern in the control condition. And these are always controlling for time 1, whatever they had rated, so this is representing change. But after they have an empathy intervention, oh my gosh, they're seeing themselves as not empathetic or lower in empathy after the intervention. Whoops. This is a trait measure of empathy. First of all, it shouldn't be changing too much, but it is. And secondly, it represents, most people see this as what empathy is. So it's a problem. Perspective taking doesn't change. Principle of care doesn't change. So these are the kind of like, wow, I guess I shouldn't have included these scales. No, I'm glad I did. I think it's more interesting this way. Here's what we're thinking about this. I'll just admit, we don't know why empathic concern has declined. We have to investigate this in our data set. And it was surprising. It was not what we predicted at all. In prior research, the trait measures of empathy are correlated with all these other things that we're measuring, so it's very surprising. So what we think maybe is there might be a contrast effect. So they might have, the participants might have been exposed to this very high standard, this 6 times a day type of thing, and so once in a while they might have received the message and been like, oh, this is annoying, why do I have to do this? Oh, God. And then like started telling themselves like, oh, well, if I'm thinking these things, I must not be an empathetic person. But over time, they were maybe becoming, I don't know, we're making this up, I'm making this up. But I gave this example to Christian to try to explain this, but I'm not really a very athletic person, but I've been taking a running class, because I'm the kind of person who needs a class for everything. So I'm learning how to run using the old-fashioned method, the book method. But anyway, I've been running more than I have in my whole life in the past like 3 weeks. I've never run so much in my whole life. But the thing is, I have this coach and all these other people who take this class who like, well, the coach especially, who's like, he's a runner, he's a real runner, and he's just like, you know, he's like 60 years old, and he's just like, yeah, I can do a 6-minute mile, whatever, but I need better goals. And so if you ask me, like, are you like a good runner? I'd be like, nope, I'm not. The standard is so high because of these other runners. And in fact, I think of myself as less of a good runner now that I actually run more. So I don't know, I think it's possible, but it's really strange. Another thing is that we were also giving them these instructions every day, which is a problem. I think we have to think of how to redesign these types of things to make them come from more in themselves. So they might have just been like, yeah, I'm doing this, but it's only because it's part of a study. Therefore, I'm not a nice person. So I'm not sure what's going on, but those are my best guesses. Summary of results. We have some changes in the emotional domain and the behavioral domain. In the empathic concern, it's the opposite than what we'd predict. But nothing's happening at this more cognitive level in terms of changes. Future directions, we're going to look at this empathic character, these people who are the highest in the sample in the various ways of measuring empathy and seeing how they respond to the intervention, but also how they just behave. But there's some, I just peeked at this a little bit, there's some evidence that the people who are very high in empathic character and then they're under this empathy intervention actually don't respond well. That it's sort of, there's some evidence that they're less happy, slightly more depressed. And this is not surprising to me because compassion fatigue is something that is quite well known for people who are like seriously carers, that they can become depleted and it's too much. But what's interesting is on the other end that the people in the self condition who are super low in empathy as a character trait actually also experience this. So I would call it ego fatigue. And it's something that no one has ever even imagined could be possible, but maybe is. So we're also going to be conducting a follow-up study. We got a small grant to do this. And I welcome your suggestions on what to measure. So if you have a skepticism about something I measured, please give me a better idea of what I should be measuring because it's going to be happening this summer. Future directions, we want to vary this intervention. We want to look at general compassion for all versus empathy. So as you can see from reading these, empathy is something that we construe it as in general is it happens within a social interaction, within relationships, but it's not necessarily, it can be, but it's not necessarily this bigger compassionate sphere outside of those relationships, although I think it's related. But it would be good to actually specifically test those components and also to compare in-person training to text message training with similar materials. We also are actually actively working on looking for grants for an empathy building app, which I think is also amusing, and I realize I do not own a smartphone, by the way. Like, I just learned to text message maybe a year ago. I mean, it's kind of funny that I'm doing this. But anyway, we do have the Templeton Foundation has asked us to submit a full proposal for the app, so I think it could be useful within like certain populations where this is kind of like the language that they're familiar with and comfortable with. And that's it, and I really appreciate any comments you might have.
We have about 10 or 15 minutes, and I thought Sara agreed to just take questions yourself.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back to front and then back to front. Okay, so go ahead.
This is a great talk.
Okay.
And I apologize, I have to leave a little bit early, but I wanted to get this comment. I'm not surprised that you find this paradoxical, oh my gosh, people are rating themselves as less empathic, which is at odds with the behavioral observations, et cetera. And I would just say that I think it's reference bias. And I think your running story aptly illustrates that. We find the same pattern of data. Like kids at the highest performing high schools rate themselves lower in Big Five conscientiousness. You know, not always, it's messy, but anyway, I think that's what you're finding, and I think you look up Steve Heine, H-E-I-N-E.
Yeah, I know him from UBC.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's good to put a term on. I wouldn't have come up with that term, but I could sort of see something happening.
And everything, so it's good.
Yeah, it's going to look real. No, I mean, I don't know. I'm going to admit that it's in the paper that we're working on right now. I'm going to admit that we don't know.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, thank you.
So I really liked your talk,
Okay.
and I'm just wondering about maybe the impact of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation.
Yes, that's what I was getting at by the fact that we're giving them these external messages, and I wonder if you have ideas about.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about that. So I was thinking about the fact that maybe if participants felt like they were choosing their behavior in some way, it might be more effective. So I'm thinking about, I don't know if any of you have had this experience. If you go onto somewhere like Hulu, right? So you want to watch a TV show, but you have to see ads. And now what Hulu does is they put up 3 ads and they let you choose your ad. Right? So somehow you feel like you're more of a participant in the advertising.
So you can have them choose like the ones that speak to them maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe you could make it, I mean, maybe you could be a little bit duplicitous where they're actually choosing between 3 different empathy prompts, but somehow they feel like they have a choice, so it feels like it's more intrinsically motivated rather than
Right.
coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, that's actually a really good suggestion. I think in terms of implementation, what I didn't mention was that, so in the study, the reason why it seemed so seamless from presenting it, but it was hard because there were almost 23,000 text messages going back and forth in the study, and so my job was that was my job, and Andrea, which is equally important job, she dealt with research assistants and training them and also implementing the lab portions. But we had them separate for a reason, was because we really did want to keep everybody blind. So even she didn't know when a participant was in a condition, and only I did until we got the data sets. So
Sara, I think that was a totally impressive study. My question is, are you going to do a follow-up with them where you take more measures? Is that just
that's what we're doing this summer.
Okay, because I have a perfect
Yes,
analogy.
please.
Because I induced people to stop lying in a pilot with 40, and then the major experiment used 110, okay, half of whom were induced to stop lying.
Oh, cool.
In the 40 that we pilot tested, when we asked them to stop lying as compared to the control group, they actually saw themselves as less honest. So we changed the scale, and we said, compared to other people, how
Thank you.
honest are you?
So that would be changing.
And that
the
changed
scale.
everything, and the pattern was exactly as you
Okay.
would expect. The people who were induced to stop lying, by week 5 out of the 10 weeks of the induction, they were rating themselves as more honest in relation to the control group. And at no point were they seeing themselves as less honest. So
That's-
changing the reference, like a couple of you have already mentioned, I have empirical evidence that worked beautifully.
So that would be a good, in terms of writing the paper, would be a good way of sort of indirectly getting at what's going on here.
Right, I mean, because right now it has no reference, right? It's just how empathic
It's just
are
the
you,
scale.
right?
Yeah. No, it's not. We don't. The scale doesn't actually ever use the word empathy, but it's things like, to what extent do you agree with the statement? I feel tender, concerned feelings for those who are suffering, or something
I
like
would
that.
say compared to
Yes,
compared to people
I think
that
it's a
you
wonderful
would
point,
do
and I
it.
think that this is probably going to help us quite a bit. So I appreciate your suggestion.
And Sara, as far as the observers, do the participants know the observers are in on the study when they're interacting with them? When the observers evaluate how it
The observers are just the research assistants. There's
so,
no.
so the participants know that they're in on the
Yeah,
study,
they're
right?
the it's the
You know
person
what you
who's running
could
the
do?
study.
Just have the observers sitting in the waiting room.
Well, it's
Don't
too late
have
now.
them know that they're.
Well, we're going to be running our follow-up. Actually, the students are off campus, so we have to do it. We only can do it by online,
Oh, online? Okay.
unless we want to
Okay.
wait till
Okay.
September.
Okay.
But we prefer to
But I
just.
think it's awesome, your study. And I think it's
I think
lovely
they're-
that you told us about all those data, because a lot of people don't report that.
Or they don't measure it. This is the thing. This is why I think the constellation method is important, because you can learn a lot more by the ways it doesn't work. Like the cognitive, we didn't find any cognitive effects either, which I think is interesting. Yeah, thank you for your comment. That's helpful. Yeah.
So, I think, as you know, just love this manipulation. It's so important and interesting, and I'm so happy that it worked on the behavior.
You never know. I'm happy it worked too. Believe me. Oh. It was.
I'm not surprised that it didn't work better on that behavior, though, for 2 reasons.
Yeah.
And one is that it's a single behavior, right? So
Yeah.
you recognize the importance of repetition on the independent variable side, right? You have them do this 6 times a day forever.
Exactly.
But then on the dependent variable side, you just have the one behavior.
Yeah.
And anything can happen in one behavior.
So what's the behavior we should be measuring this summer?
Well, so multiple behaviors, more than one.
Okay.
And then secondly, I look at the behaviors that you're manipulating, and there's not a lot of overlap between those behaviors and the one you measured,
Yes.
right? So if you're trying to get people to send text messages, to avoid distractions and concentrate on someone, do small, nice things for people, that's the closest one to the one the
Right.
variable you measured. Smile at the next person you see, and use active listening. So it seems to me that really a way to test this maybe would be to put them in a group setting a few times and see how much they're using active listening, how much they're concentrating on the person, and things like that. So the things that you manipulated. So do that like 3 or 4 times,
Mhm.
and measure the same thing you manipulated, and then do it 3 or 4 times, so you can get at, transient situational factors are always going to add a huge amount of error variance to your prediction. So you're always going to be
Yeah,
you're always
so-
going to be fighting against that.
So in some ways, maybe that would explain why the research assistants rated them differently. Maybe like they were just giving them eye contact and they were smiling and sort of these little things. And I think, we're doing more than just behaviors though, and that's important because we were just asking them to practice like the emotional and intellectual tests as well. And the way this worked is that they were randomized to receive these text messages. And over the period of the study, it turned out to be 4 times per message, with the only rule that there couldn't be one message back to back that was the same, but otherwise was completely random. So they're getting this interspersed type of experience during the study that involves a few behaviors, but actually the majority are not behavioral. But I agree with you that one behavior isn't going to do it. And we were very constrained. It was already a 2-hour lab session, so we were pretty constrained by being able to actually keep them there longer. But if anyone has ideas on like how would I get a behavior online, what we're thinking of right now is like maybe prisoner dilemma or something.
We have some ideas we can talk to you about.
I would love to hear. Yes, so thank you. Because we're really at the IRB stage right now. We're asking for an amendment. We're planning on running it next couple months. So we're scratching our heads too, because we know this is a problem and we want more behavior, but then online it's harder to do. So, thank you. Yeah.
Sarah, this is really interesting. Thank you for it. I wanted to offer an alternative explanation to
Okay,
your
great.
bias.
Yay, radical skepticism. Woo.
Yeah. No, the alternative explanation for the lower rating of empathic
the empathic concern,
the
okay.
lower self-report rating. I'm not at all surprised by this. Seems
Okay,
like this
so-
is exactly what I would have expected, because look what you just did for the last, I forget how long you did this, but you asked people
2
to
weeks.
do things that probably some of them found very difficult to do, right? I mean, try to see the world the way somebody else does. If you think about your last social interaction, reflect on somebody close to you. Imagine that you're inside their mind. What do you think they're thinking about? Or you look at the emotional stuff, try to feel their pain. Imagine what else they're feeling. And I can imagine a lot of people not necessarily having the response you suggested. Oh, I'm bothered by this. I don't want to do this right now. But I'm trying to do this, and I'm finding it very difficult.
It hurts my brain. That's what
Right?
you're saying?
I'm not good at this, right?
Yeah.
So my alternative explanation would be something like inflated self-evaluation. There's probably a psychological name for this, right? The people in the initial reporting, self-report of their empathic concern, just have an overinflated evaluation of how good they are at this because they haven't been trying to do it, right? How good are you at ice skating? Oh, I'm great, and then you put you out on the
How good
ice
are you
for
at
a
running?
week, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's not about you comparing yourself with a reference to somebody else who's better than you. I think it's just now that you're trying to do it, you realize how bad you are. I'm not very good at this, and so it seems to me that is a moral improvement, right?
Okay, I don't know. It's hard for me to argue that the decline in a self-perception of being or kind to others is a moral improvement.
Well, it's a moral improvement because they realize now that they've got a deficiency that they need to work on, right? I'm not as good at this as I should be, and if they care, right? If they care to get better at that, I mean, that's a good place to start, right? I mean, you've helped them to see that they're not as empathic as they.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's difficult to say for example, with the data I have showing that they're saying the reason they volunteer is because they want to help people. So these same people, it's the same people. They're saying I want to help people, but I'm not a person who like feels concern when somebody's in distress. It's just, I don't know. I guess I have to wrap my mind around it still, but I think that's one potential. Another potential explanation is that basically it became the subjective feeling of it became difficult. So maybe things had changed, but they started to see themselves differently because it was hard to. Norbert Schwartz has done work on this, that if you ask people right now, for example, try to think of like 12 ways that you're a kind person, most of us will like, write, and then we'll stop around like 9 and be like, oh my, I'm not a good person because I can't, it's so hard for me to think of it. This is a classic Norbert Schwartz thing. But when you say try and think of 2 ways that you're a kind person, everyone's like, oh, I'm a really kind person. But when you look at how many on average they've done, the people in the one condition, when they start saying they're not a good person, that they've come up with like 9 of them compared to 2, but they subjectively feel like they're not a kind person because it was so difficult. That's what you're saying, right?
Close.
Oh,
Yeah.
Not quite?
Yeah, not quite. I mean, you're actually trying to get. So it would be, the analogy would be you're trying to you suggest them to do a kind act, right? And they find it hard to do, right? I mean, that's what I think is going on. You suggest them to do something that they find very difficult, right? Imagine what kind of challenges do you think that person is facing? Oh gosh, I wasn't even paying attention to what they said to me. I have no idea what's going on in their life. I don't care about people as much as I thought I did. Right? I mean, that's the
Yeah, okay. So that there's this process of self-talk that might be going on. They get this message and they go, oh my gosh, why wasn't I thinking? This seems to be measuring something like, they probably figured out like empathy, why don't I think of these things?
I want to do one more question, then we have to move on so that we can.
Well, I was just pointing out my notes, so I didn't have a question.
I can answer that very easily. Thank you. Okay.
It might be a quick question about the self. I was surprised about the self condition, and that it was similar to the control. I'm assuming that's why you collapsed it. Because I wonder if there was a worry that you'd making people more narcissistic or more selfish or something like that.
What we're going to do for our paper is we're going to present everything, like the full mean. So there were some cases where the control group didn't differ from the self group, and there were some cases where it did. So it's just, but mostly, I mean, we're dealing with the college student population, so they didn't change too much.
Because that suggests that maybe by default people are as selfish as the self condition, which is kind of a depressing.
Well, people is a huge generalization. Maybe people who chose to be in our study and earn a lot of money to be in our study, maybe, I don't know. But, okay, thank you very much for your comments, and of course, I can talk afterwards.